Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this panel event, Testing the Strength of Eurosceptics After Covid-19 and Brexit. My name is Dr. Toby Greene. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Political Studies at Bar-Ilan University, and I'm very pleased to be chairing this event on behalf of the Israel Association for the Study of European Integration. And for those of you who may not have participated in one of our events before, the Israel Association for the Study of European Integration was founded in 1992, and we aim to promote the study of European integration and the European Union in Israel. And we bring together scholars and students, but also practitioners, including diplomats, journalists, and members of the business community. And just to mention that today's event is on the record, and we are recording and live tweeting, and we have a new Twitter account, so please do follow us and tweet about the event using our Twitter address, which is at IASEI1. That's at IASEI1. If I have a moment, I'll copy it into the chat as well. And if you follow us, of course, we'll be happy to follow you back. Today we are, as I said, testing the strength of Eurosceptics after COVID-19 and Brexit. And we really felt that this was an important moment to get a Europe-wide comparative snapshot of the state of radical right and Eurosceptic politics. Our political world has been shaken and shaken again by Brexit, by COVID, by political upheaval in the United States also. And coronavirus itself has in many cases sharpened the debate between liberal internationalists who favour an open world of global cooperation and trade and anti-globalists who favour a bordered world with the interests of the nation protected by the sovereign state. In the EU, we've seen this in debates over border controls, over vaccine procurement, and over funds for economic recovery. And in Europe, we face a series of pivotal elections in the coming 12 to 18 months. So against this backdrop, are anti-globalist Eurosceptic parties strengthening or weakening? So we have an outstanding panel to give perspectives from several European countries. But before I introduce them, I want to briefly hand over to Micky, who is the project manager in the Israel office of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung. The FES has been a long-time supporter of our association, and we're very, very grateful for their support. So Micky, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Dear Toby Greene, lecturer in the Department for Political Studies at Bar-Ilan University. Dear Dr. Maya Sion-Tzidkiyahu, co-president of the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration. Distinguished speakers from Israel and abroad. Dear colleagues and friends, we are now in the 9th year of excellent cooperation with the Association for the Study of European Integration. First of all, thank you, Maya, for this great partnership between us. The aim of this series is to assist in promoting the understanding of European integration and Europe among academics, governmental officials, and the wider public in Israel. Usually, in normal times, we hold events like this one at leading universities, like the Bar-Ilan University and academic colleges in Israel, with the aim to bring distinguished lecturer guests from abroad and assemble discussion panels around the guests with leading Israeli lecturers and prominent figures specialized in European affairs. We do so because we want to facilitate exchanges of decision makers and experts, thus introducing each other's viewpoints in the public discourse. Now we are forced to do so by Zoom, which also has its advantages, as all of us know, like assembling high-ranking experts like you without spending too much time and efforts in logistics. Together we choose relevant topics like the one we are discussing today. One of the strategic targets of FAS work in Israel is strengthening Israeli-European alliances and disseminating information about the EU in Israel and vice versa. This is very important since Israeli-European relations are complex and ambivalent. We try to introduce European viewpoints into the Israeli discourse and Israeli viewpoints into the European one. Now some words about today's challenging and most relevant topic. The pandemic will hopefully be a one-off experience. However, the economic, social, and political wounds that it inflicts reveal the vulnerability of the European Union and past political failings. Actually, we're talking here about European solidarity in and after the crisis. It is not the first time that we as FS Israel deal with this issue. Together with the Israeli Association for the Study of European Integration, we held a web seminar with the title COVID-19 and the Rebordering of EU Spaces. With the help of 4 leading international border scholars, we discussed the question whether borders will return to their pre-corona status or will they remain relatively closed in the coming years, a policy which maybe some governments are eager to pursue. But even before Corona and after Brexit, we organized a conference on social solidarity in the European Union, addressing the challenges of populism, where we explored the question whether closer social integration, consisting in more comprehensive politics of solidarity and inclusive distribution of wealth across member states, is a promising way forward. This is a question, of course. I would also like to mention a survey on European sovereignty, which has been conducted recently by Ipsos Public Affairs for the Fondation Jean-Jaurès and the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung. 8,000 people from 8 different EU member states have been sampled on this issue. I just would like to quote from one question regarding what people feel towards the EU. The question was, with regard to the EU, some people claim to be in favor of it, while others are against it. Where would you personally rank yourself on this scale? The average grade was 6.4. 0 means you are totally opposed, and 10 means you are completely in favor. The meaning is that the EU is appreciated in a moderate way only, which is not enough in building solidarity. We believers in Europe and in European solidarity will have to work very hard to strengthen the trust in the EU. I believe that there is no going back to normal after Brexit and the pandemic. The crisis should be used as an opportunity for closer cooperation in the EU and a readjustment of Europe as a community of values. I wish us all an exciting and fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Micky, so much. So I'm keen to get straight to our speakers, so I'm going to keep these introductions very, very brief. We're going to first hear from Paul Taggart, Professor of Politics at the University of Sussex, one of the world's leading experts on populism and Euroscepticism, who's going to kick us off in a moment with a Europe-wide perspective. Then we'll hear from Dr. Stijn van Kessel, the Senior Lecturer in European Politics at Queen Mary University of London, who's going to help us focus on the Netherlands ahead of general elections taking place there next Wednesday. Then we'll turn to Dr. Constanze Stelzenmueller, Fritz Stern Chair on Germany and Transatlantic Relations at the Brookings Institution, who will give us a perspective on Germany, where there will be a series of state elections, including 2 next week, and of course a federal election in September. And then we'll hear from Dr. Jean-Yves Camus, Director of the Observatoire de Radicalités Politiques at the Fondation Jean-Jaurès in Paris, who will give us a perspective on France, which faces regional elections in the summer, and of course a parliamentary and presidential election next year. And finally, from Gisela Dax, Professor at the European Forum and the Center for German Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who will help us draw some comparisons with our own situation here in Israel, where we too face elections, our 4th in less than 2 years. And whilst Israel is not an EU member, we certainly have radical right, nationalist and anti-globalist politics in play. So our speakers will speak for a maximum of 8 minutes each, leaving, I hope, a decent amount of time for questions. And if you would like to ask a question, please make that known in the chat. Please state your name and affiliation, and we'll call on as many as possible. And if you prefer, you may also write your question in the chat, but please no more than 1 sentence. And if we don't have time to call on everyone, we may be able to refer to some of those questions written in the chat and get some responses from our panel. So without further ado, please, Paul, lead us off.
Thank you very much, Toby, and thanks for the invitation to take part in this. I've been asked to talk about an overview of European Euroscepticism and as a response to the pandemic. I'm going to ruin the ending of this, ruin the suspense that I'm going to give you, and tell you the conclusion is it's too early to tell, and it's complicated. So a sort of mixture of showing lies, reflection on Western civilization, and Facebook status. But that's the answer, and I'm really interested to hear what Stijn and Constanze and Jean-Yves and Gisela tell us about the other countries. But I want to make, in my short introduction, I want to try and give you some perspective, and I want to make 4 very broad points, I think, to try and frame the discussion. The first point I want to make is about Euroscepticism in general and the importance of Euroscepticism across Europe. And I'm going to do what a lot of academics do and say it's important to be clear on your concepts here. I think it's really important, and you might imagine why somebody from the UK might say this, but I think it's really important to differentiate between Euroscepticism that leads you to want to exit from the European Union from Euroscepticism that is still fundamentally critiquing the EU, but stops short of wanting to leave. This is a distinction that we would term hard Euroscepticism, or those that want to leave the European Union, and soft Eurosceptics are those that don't want to leave, but want to fundamental reform. And I think there's a real danger that we tend to conflate those two and to essentially draw conclusions about hard Euroscepticism from soft Euroscepticism. The simple fact of the matter is, if you look across Europe, hard Euroscepticism is extremely rare phenomenon, a minor concern, with one big exception, but that big exception just left, and that's the UK. If you look at just take the 2019 European parliamentary elections, you're looking at parties that got something like 0.8% of the vote in the countries that they stood that are hard Eurosceptic. 15 countries, 15 parties across the European Union stood, as far as I can see, for European parliamentary elections and were hard Eurosceptic. So it's a very, very small minority concern. I think it's very important, but it's still a minority concern. Soft Euroscepticism, those that are fundamentally critical of the European Union or the idea of European integration, are much more numerous. So there's something like 77 parties that are soft Eurosceptic in the European Parliament at the moment, and compared to the 15 hard Eurosceptics. So I just want to make that distinction there. When we're talking about Euroscepticism, we shouldn't always assume that what the Euroscepticism amounts to withdrawing from the European Union. And I say that as a Brit, somebody where the two are very much conflated. The UK is exceptional. That's not to say that it might not emerge elsewhere, but I just want to make that my first plea. So that's my first point. Second point I'd make, and I'm sure that this will come up with other people, is that, again, generalizing about the pandemic, I think is a danger. And I think really we should differentiate between three different aspects of it. I think differentiating first from the health crisis, the coronavirus health issue, and the way that Europe has had to respond to it is one of the key issues. And what's been interesting about that, certainly in the initial phase, was that was a process of essentially of national empowerment and of closing borders, and actually of empowering expertise in ways that had been disempowered. All of those trends, to some extent, went against Euroscepticism, or to some extent took the wind out of the Eurosceptic sails, because if national responses could occur for the pandemic, it showed that the European Union was not necessarily dominating nation states. The second aspect of the pandemic is the economic crisis, and I think that the way that the European Union has dealt with that, especially in terms of the recovery package that was agreed in sort of between December and February, is extremely significant, and it wasn't without problems, and it wasn't without issues of the rule of law and the issue that came with Hungary and Poland particularly. And it also was quite innovative in creating new weapons of financial instruments of raising loans to do this. So that in a sense was a very different response. But we, as you all know, we've yet to see the full effects of the economic implications of the pandemic. That really is too soon to tell, and that will be something that will roll out over the next few years. We know that from previous crises. And the third aspect of the pandemic is obviously the vaccination response and the very differentiated response that has been there. And I think it would be fair to say that the European Commission has not covered itself with glory, and that various nation states have not particularly been very effective at exercising the powers that they have. And I think that gives ammunition for Euroscepticism in the future. But again, we're only at the beginning of that, and that has yet to be seen. But the pandemic has those three aspects to it, to me: the health crisis, the economic crisis, and the vaccination response. In terms of what can we know about Euroscepticism as a response to, blending those together, those different crises, what do we know? Well, we know that public opinion last year didn't really shift very dramatically on the European Union. If you look at Eurobarometer polls taken in the autumn of 2019 and compare those that were conducted in the summer of 2020, there was very little movement. A few countries shifted a bit. But if you look at levels of distrust, it didn't significantly change. A couple of exceptions, a couple of countries you do see that, but broadly that there wasn't in that year a particular backlash in terms of public opinion. People, there wasn't an increase of people distrusting the European Union. There are lots of explanations for that, but I think others can think about those. Then we turn to what about political parties? And I suspect that might be the interest of the other contributors, not only, but that might be something we could look at. And here I do fall back with what I said at the beginning. It's very hard to generalize. I think that it's been surprising that actually that the political parties, the populist parties and non-populist parties that are Eurosceptic have not yet managed to make full hay from the difficulties of the European Union about the vaccine crisis and the potential difficulties of the economic crisis and the responses of the EU therein. So far, I would say that actually we've yet to see very little impact on the parties. In terms of countries, of course, we're going to look at some countries that have elections coming up, and that way may well see that. But it's very, very hard to generalize. That's often been the nature of Euroscepticism. It's usually been bound up with very particular national context. You know, if we look at countries like Italy, where we've seen a growth of Euroscepticism, we've seen more Eurosceptic parties emerge, but you know, we've ended up with a technocratic Europhilic government with the membership of those self-same Eurosceptic parties. That's pretty hard to comprehend. It's interesting, but it's hard to comprehend without knowing something about Italian politics. And I think that says as much about Italy as it does about the European Union. I suspect, therefore, it's very hard for us to make broad brush statements. So essentially, I think that the pandemic and the three different elements of it have provided some ammunition for Eurosceptics on the one hand, but they've also removed some of the momentum from Eurosceptics with the other. And I think that is yet to be played out. I think that the generalizations that we make, we need to be very, very careful about in terms of differentiating between what sort of Euroscepticism are we talking about and really being sensitive to national context. So I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic, Paul. Thank you. You've given us some really helpful framing terms and some structure to work with. So very grateful for that introduction. Thank you so much. So we'll turn now to Stijn, on kind of going almost chronologically in terms of forthcoming elections. We've got one
party to the other, a lot of new parties emerging. It's not entirely as chaotic as one might think, because voters mainly move into broadly defined right-wing and left-wing blocks. So that's what this graph depicts. So on top you have the right-wing voters who move between, broadly speaking, right-wing parties, left-wing voters who don't move from left-wing to right-wing parties or vice versa, but who stay in this left and right block. So what it basically means is that you have these mainstream party families, and they get more competitors with more logic than it seems. And at the bottom part, I think my connection is unstable. I get a warning. I hope you can still hear me.
We lost you just for a moment, but I hear you now.
Okay, yeah, good. The bottom just shows the non-voters who most of them don't vote between elections, and yeah. So that's the main message. So you have broadly defined blocks and similar parties that are competing with one another. The next slide, yeah, there we go. These are the opinion polls ahead of next week. So from a few days ago, you see two bars for each party. So the left-wing bar, the gray bar, shows how many votes, the percentage of vote that this party got in the last election of 2017. And what at first sight, nothing much seems to change. So the polls ahead of the election look quite similar to the ones of 4 years ago, which is quite remarkable because a lot happened, right? Especially in the past few years. So the VVD, the Liberals on the left-hand side are still largest. They look to increase their vote share a little bit, which is basically, they also then increase their seat share. If I have a graph of the seat share, it's exactly the same as the vote share, again, because of the system being so proportional. A few takeaway message, because it's too much to just capture all. So the current government is the Liberals, VVD, CDA, which is the third party, the Christian Democrats, also center-right, D66 next to it, which are the social liberals. So they're culturally liberal, but they're center-right in terms of economic positions, kind of like the Lib Dems in the UK. And the Christian Union, which is the CU, which you see a bit further, which is a more, a Christian party, quite socially conservative, but kind of left to the center on economic issues. So four-party coalition, and we might see the same coalition back after next week, because not a lot of things have changed. One other thing to note is that there's a clear center-right or a clear right-wing majority, because the radical right also plays an important part in the Dutch party landscape, with the PVV being the largest, which is the second party from the left that still competes to be again the second party after the next election. FVD is the new radical right party on the block. You see it as the third to the right party. A more extreme party, you might say, under leadership of Thierry Baudet. You see his picture there. It looked like it would slowly overtake Wilders' Freedom Party. Wilders, you see him depicted also. However, approaching the elections for various reasons, Wilders seems to retain his popularity and again remain the most important far-right party in the Netherlands. Sorry, there's an ambulance behind me, so that might be a bit disturbing. There might even be a third radical right party in the Netherlands after next week, which is Ja21, which is a split from the Forum for Democracy. So we have three radical right parties in the Netherlands, perhaps in Parliament in a week from now. At the same time, it shows that the left is sort of lying on its back almost. So the PVDA does not really seem to recover from its really major blow of 4 years ago. They're polling now 8.7% of the vote. So it's one of these kind of medium-sized parties, but it's certainly very far behind the Liberals. The SP is the more radical left party. GL is the Greens, Green left. But together they are very far from sort of a majority in parliament. So it's clearly the right that currently dominates Dutch politics. I can't say that much more about it, I think, because otherwise I'll just use too much time. One final thing, it's remarkable that the government does not really get punished for its imperfect approach to Corona. The Netherlands is one of the harder hit countries, but voters especially do not punish Prime Minister Rutte for that. Prime Minister Rutte is likened to a Teflon politician who just doesn't get blamed for things, even though he should. I'll go to the next slide to sort of give some pointers about the current campaign, and then also move to the topic of the EU campaign. Very crowded.
Spain, if you can.
Sorry?
Just another minute, if you can.
Oh, okay. I'll be very quick then. I'll move to Europe very quickly. So the campaign is a crowded field. It's a bit confusing because broadcasters try to represent all the different viewpoints, which makes the campaign rather chaotic, at least in my perspective. It's quite lackluster. There's very little street campaigning apart from Forum for Democracy's Thierry Baudet, who kind of denies that Corona is a dangerous disease by now. So he's the only one who actually goes out on the street. Short-term perspective, no long-term visions, reduced salience of cultural themes such as immigration and cultural immigration, because it's much more about the economy right now and supporting people and businesses to get out of the crisis in an unscathed way. I don't know how to precisely say that. So the VVD, the Liberals, aim to capitalize on the personal popularity of Mark Rutte, who kind of tries to depoliticize elections. He's kind of a politician without a vision. He's often blamed for that. And he now literally says political parties should not make promises at a time like this. And a lot of the Dutch political scientists got very angry about that, because what is then the democratic function of elections, right? He sort of tries to to literally depoliticize the elections. It's looking like we're heading for another broad center-right coalition. under his leadership because he remains popular. Finally, the EU elephant in the room. So someone, I'm not quite sure, made this Twitter account basically protesting the fact that the EU is not a big theme in the Dutch election campaign, and it says, "Tag me if you want that the EU becomes a more important theme in the campaign." And a lot of Dutch political scientists actually make use of this hashtag to also sort of protest, well, the European integration is super important, but why does no one talk about it? But no one does talk about, or at least that's a bit, it's certainly not a salient theme. It's certainly not a theme that is central to the campaign. Mainstream parties tend to be pragmatic and support the EU for that, but don't have clear visions about its future. The debate hardly goes beyond the simplistic for and against narrative. So nothing new really in this regard. There are pro-European parties, D66 and Volt, interestingly, this pan-European party, which is pro-European, but which argues in favor of quite big reforms to the EU infrastructure. It might win 1 or 2 seats, which is quite interesting from political scientists' perspective who focus on the issue of European integration, because they might contribute to the salience of the theme more generally. These are the Eurosceptic parties, the radical left SP, but clearly it's soft Eurosceptic, whereas the 2 far-right parties are hard Eurosceptic. So they're both in favor of an exit, which is quite, you might say, unusual for radical right parties because most remain soft Eurosceptic. However, the Dutch ones are hard Eurosceptic, but they do little to increase the salience. I've just finished Geert Wilders, the Freedom Party's manifesto. There's a single paragraph hidden away somewhere about the topic of the EU. The EU features here and there throughout the program, but this is a stark contrast if you compare it with the program of 2012, where the program started with the EU as a theme. So Wilders doesn't really want to talk about the EU. Also in debates, he kind of avoids it. That leads me to conclude that Euroscepticism is also not the key characteristic of the Dutch far right. They don't really want to talk about it. So it's kind of incorrect to, they are Eurosceptic parties, but they're not Eurosceptic parties first and foremost. So thanks very much. I'm sorry I went a bit over, and I welcome any questions that you might have about Dutch politics.
Thank you so much, Stijn. That's great. So my sense so far is that if we're looking for a COVID impact on European politics, we have not found major evidence for it so far. But what about in Germany? Constanze, can we go over to you, please?
Yes. Good morning from Washington, DC, everyone. Thank you for having me on this panel. And I would frankly much rather be in Israel right now. I do miss Israeli food. And I suspect the weather would be a little bit nicer than it is here, although it's not bad. The other disclaimer that I want to make is that I am a security and foreign policy sort of person. So this is part of my field, but not all of it. That said, it is I am a sort of become a Germany explainer here at my institution at Brookings in Washington, and so it is my business to also do this stuff. And I want to join Stijn van Kessel in emphasizing how important it is to be specific about what we mean by Euroscepticism. That is, I think, there is a huge spectrum there, and I think that Professor Taggart didn't say this, but might have pointed out that even the most hard-right governments in the European Union are like the Hungarians, who have rebuilt their constitution and turned it into a one-party state, have absolutely no interest in leaving the European Union. In fact, Orban in his famous speeches likes to say that he wants to remake the European Union, but the one thing that he doesn't want is to forego access to European Union funding. None of the hard right in Europe want that, I think. And so while they will talk the talk, they very rarely walk the walk. I do also think that Brexit has had something of a deterrent effect here. Although the test, as far as I'm concerned, I'm very curious to see what Professor Camus has to say on this point. The test might come with the 2022 French elections and Marine Le Pen. that's the one case where I wonder whether she might not want to take France in that direction. I also find not a small irony in the fact that I was speaking to you from Washington, where I've lived since 2014, and have lived through 4 years of a virulently anti-EU Trump government in ways that were really quite startlingly hostile. One American-Israeli thinker that has had a lot of currency over here is Yoram Hazony. Some of you may have seen his book, The Virtue of Nationalism. If not, I urge you to take a look at it. It's, if I may be brutally frank, it strikes me as a cheap version of Carl Schmitt. And I do not mean that, and I do not mean that as praise. Obviously, as a German, no, how would I? But there has been a distinct shift from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. The Biden administration is explicitly, publicly pro-European Union, although I would add to that, an important caveat, I have the distinct sense that while that is a generally friendly attitude, it is not actually thought out in terms of strategy. It's not clear to me that this American government has really paid that much attention to what it is about the European Union that constitutes power assets that might be of utility to American purposes in Europe and elsewhere. But that's by the by. You want me to talk about Germany. And again, there are, you have to be very specific about what you mean by Euroscepticism. And I think a key point here is that even some of the most traditionally pro-European parties in Germany, like the Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, the Greens, have actually not been notably in favor of deeper European integration. I think that's become most obvious in the very muted responses to French President Emmanuel Macron's grand plans outlined in a number of his speeches. Merkel herself is the architect of a return of German Europe policy to intergovernmentalism, something that she has called in a speech in Bruges a decade ago, the union method. So integrationism, or deeper integration, currently has few real friends, although I think you can probably talk to a lot of people about banking integration, about tax harmonization, that kind of thing, but nothing on the level advocated by Macron. That's also important to understand. Conversely, not even the German hard right, it seems to me, the Alternative for Germany, or the extreme left, Die Linke, are at this point advocating a German exit from the European Union. There were currents of that during the Eurozone crisis, the fight over the bailouts for Portugal and Greece and others. But I think that has basically gone away. But I would also add the caveat, I think that it's long-term consequently to talk about this. Now, on the German elections, for the longest time, for about a year now, the German polls have been rock solid in a way that I find sort of quite disconcerting. The CDU has had a solid 30 plus 35% poll share, followed by the Greens, somewhere between 20 and 22. The Social Democrats have not managed to get beyond 15 or 16, despite the fact that they are in the government, that they're doing a solid job in Merkel's government, and that they are the co-architects, if not the architects, of the European recovery package. Life is unfair. And then there is the opposition leader, which regrettably is the Alternative for Germany, which came into the Bundestag for the first time in 2017 at 12.6% and has been languishing in sort of single digit to 10% maximum regions, again, for a year. It's also just been put under national surveillance by the domestic intelligence services because it has become very visibly radicalized. The so-called Flügel, the hard right wing, has supposedly dissolved itself, but in reality, its personnel is still there, and they are the ones in power and calling the shots. At the same time, they're mired in infighting, and the AfD has notably been incapable of gaining any traction from the pandemic for reasons quite similar to what Paul Taggart and Stein van Kessel have outlined. They simply have no recipes for a time in which coherent, calm, fact-based, science-based government action is required. And the two parties I haven't mentioned are the Liberals and Die Linke, which regularly poll at somewhere around 8%. Now, as you said, there are two regional elections this weekend on Sunday in Baden-Württemberg and Rhineland-Pfalz, two quite wealthy Western states, which are thought to be bellwethers for the Christian Democrats in particular. This is complicated by the fact that there's a very popular Green minister-president who is the German version of a rhino. In other words, he's green in name only. He likes to speak of himself as conservative, and in any other political universe, he would be a conservative. And the Greens there have, of course, very much moved into the middle of society. And in Rhineland-Pfalz, you have a very popular minister-president in Manu Dreyer, who's a social democrat. But what we're all waiting for, yes, I'm nearly done. What we're all waiting for is to see the impact of a corruption scandal that's currently roiling the CDU, where several members of the CDU have taken huge cuts out of mask procurement deals. And that might be the first thing to genuinely upend the sort of cemented survey landscape that we've seen for the past year. So the bottom line of what I think I expect in September, and that I think is the most significant impact of the AfD, is not a resurgence of the hard right now or in September. I don't expect a significant impact of the German conspiracy theorists, the German version of QAnon, although that is the strongest version in Europe. What I do expect, and that is, I think, bad enough for Germany and for Europe, is a highly fragmented political landscape, a distrust in the mainstream political parties because of these corruption scandals, perhaps an increase in the in non-voting rates, and possibly very complicated and very drawn out coalition negotiations, which again will lead to increased frustration among German citizens, as we're still struggling with vaccine governance, health governance, and the long-drawn consequences, economic and political consequences of the pandemic. And all this at a time when there is an expectation of German leadership in Europe and in the transatlantic alliance. That's my greatest concern. We're not going to leave the European Union, but an introverted, inward-looking, semi-capable, frustrated and fragmented Germany is bad news for all of Europe. Thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you very, very much. Okay, well, let's turn to Paris now and to Jean-Yves, and let's see if the pattern continues or we have a different picture in France.
Well, we have a picture that's I would say quite gloomy, because according to two different opinion polls that were published recently in the 2022 election, Marine Le Pen would poll 48%, between 47 and 48%, against Macron being re-elected with only 52 to 53%, whereas in 2017 he polled 66 and Marine Le Pen polled 33, and 33% was the highest vote ever for the then Front National. But the question is this rise in the surveys because of the COVID crisis and because of the bad management of the health crisis. I do not believe it is so. First of all, you have to know that the three major reasons why people say they want to vote for Le Pen is, one, law and order, and this is very similar to what in the polls some 25 to 30 years ago. The second reason is immigration. And the third reason is, I would say, the fact that more and more French people say, well, since 1981, we've seen the Conservatives, and then the Social Democrats, and then the Conservatives, and then the left again, and back and forth, and they did not make anything good. So we want to try the alternative, try a global alternative, and the National Front, the former National Front, is seen as the first and foremost alternative to the so-called system. But when it comes to the impact of the COVID crisis, I would say the results are quite mitigated. At the start of the pandemic, Le Pen was the only party leader who said, well, there's some kind of a conspiracy at the head of the state to try to make people believe that we are in a capacity to stop the pandemic, and in fact, that is not the case. Nothing was done to take care of the equivalent of the NHS, of the French Health Service. The situation is very bad. We have very few doctors. We do not have masks, and so on. And I think that she made a mistake at that time, because saying the scope of the pandemic and the number of deaths every day on their TV screens, the French people wanted to get some assurance from the state and from the politicians that the pandemic was about to be controlled, or at least that something was being done to control the pandemic. They wanted to, I would say, have someone tell them that, well, the situation is bad, but we'll take care of it, and we will prove you that we are able to take care. What Marine Le Pen did was exactly the opposite. The situation was bad, and she told people that the situation would become worse and worse and worse, and that many, many people would die, which of course is a very bad way, in my opinion, to try to get popular support. The second point is, during the time of the pandemic, many French people were able to see that European cooperation was something positive. At the start of the pandemic, some of the people who were in the hospital in France with the worst cases of COVID were treated in Germany, were treated in Belgium, were treated in Luxembourg, in Switzerland, and so on. And that was a very good news. I mean, we were not in a capacity to treat the most severe cases, and people were sent abroad over short distances, especially in northern and eastern France, and they got treated successfully. So most people say, okay, there's something positive about the EU. And then, maybe the most important thing is that, is Marine Le Pen really Eurosceptic anymore? In 2017, she was. I mean, she campaigned on the topic of opting out of the EU if she were elected. But just after the election, she realized that in fact she did not propose anything positive. We will opt out. Okay, and so what? What will become of her? So, for 3 or 4 months after the election, she changed her mind and explained her voters and the French people that, well, next time she would say, we will not opt out. If I will be elected, I will first of all see how things are going with Brussels, and at the end of my term, if things are going bad with Brussels, I will put the question on referendum, and the French people will decide if they want to Brexit or not, or remain. This is a big change. What Marine Le Pen basically says now is that the EU should be reformed. with different values, with different mechanism of bureaucracy, less bureaucracy, much more efficiency, more powers to the nation state and so on. But she does not say, I want to opt out, simply because most of her constituency is afraid of what would become if France would opt out, especially the younger people who have known only the Euro and the European Union are not ready to settle for anything less than remaining, maybe remaining with different policies. But if you tell a youngster 20 to 25 years old, we will opt out of the Euro, oh, and so what? What will become of? And I think that the voters of the National Front, of the Rassemblement National, totally agree with this. They're totally in line with Marine Le Pen's decision not to opt for Brexit. So it's not because of the pandemic, it's not because of Euroscepticism that Marine Le Pen is very high in the polls. It's simply because we have had some dramatic changes here in this country over the last 5 years, with Islam becoming an everyday topic in the political debate, not only Islamic movements and terrorism, but Islam as a religion, and the capacity of Islam to, I would say, fit into the French secular model. This is something you can hear every day from on TV, on radio, in papers, from Marine Le Pen, but also from mainstream conservative and even from liberal leaders. The second problem is law and order. We now have a difficult situation in some of the French suburbs with riots and with clashes between the police and the youth. And as always, the National Front is the party that seems to be, I would say, able to restore law and order. So my personal opinion is that there are two very important topics with regard to the 2022 election. The first one is how many people will go to the polls. We've had local elections at the beginning of 2020. On the first round, only 42% went to the polls, and on the second round, which took place in June, only 32% went to the polls. So the first issue is participation, how many people will vote, and the second issue is...
Just another minute, please, Jean-Yves.
Yes. The second issue, I think, is about French identity, not about the pandemic, and not about leaving the EU.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Have you finished?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off just as you were coming to the conclusion. But thank you so much. So very interesting that Marine Le Pen flying high in the polls, but apparently not because of Euroscepticism. Okay, so now an opportunity to draw some comparisons with our situation here in Israel. Gisela, I wonder what echoes you're hearing that resonate with our situation here. Oh, Gisela, you're on mute.
First of all, thank you very much for organizing this. And definitely Israel is not in Europe, but from Europe, as Dandina always had written. I just like to mention the study of the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation that was done together with a foundation, Jean-Jaurès in Paris, that Micky mentioned before. I think there was an interesting point about that 8 countries had been asked about their attitude to national sovereignty and European sovereignty. And in fact, what was interesting that even countries with the most Eurosceptics in Eastern Europe, in a way, were also very much in favor of European sovereignty as much as of national sovereignty. So there was apparently no contradiction between both. This might bring us closer to our discussion that you have contradictory trends going on at the same time where people live apparently pretty well with it. When we come to Israel, I was thinking how to bring this issue in. I mean, we have upcoming elections in less than 2 weeks. They are the 4th elections in 2 years. And I'd like to briefly touch upon three issues: the inner Israeli dynamics, the relations of Israel with Europe, and the dynamics within the region, where the pandemic plays a role, but not in every aspect. I mean, Israel, which has been seen the champions of the vaccines, the big laboratory, seems to be the first to get a little bit out of the pandemic. At least I just told before yesterday, I was sitting for the first time in a cafe. Today you would hear for the first time after a long time in the radio, health experts being very optimistic that the vaccines work against mutations and that really there might be no further lockdown. Still in the framework of also elections, others point out still there were 6,000 dead people. You had 3 or even 4 lockdowns. It was hard on the resilience of the public and the economy. And the success is mainly due to the vaccinations. The management in itself by the government was rather poor. There was a zigzagging of the finance ministry, the Ministry of Education. There was no differentiated lockdown according to a traffic-like system. This was out of fear of alienating specific groups. So it was power politics that was played out here. But still, and this might surprise or even less surprise after having heard now the others, there are no drastic changes foreseen for the outcome of the elections. So although economic issues are a major factor, as the polls show, the voters tend to stick to their parties. So they had a few, as we have this during all the last 3 elections, always new parties coming up, new center party splits things. But feelings of belonging to one camp or the other, and I think we heard this also from Holland here, is apparently more determining the voting preferences. So in Israel, this is also a trend since a while. The right is stronger than the left since a while. There's right and center. And if Netanyahu, the prime minister, will be challenged, it will probably come from the right, or most probably, if at all. And we might have another similar outcome like the other times before of elections, meaning no clear majority. So if we link this to COVID, one can say it had really so far not so much of an impact. I mean, Netanyahu is priding himself of having organized in time the vaccines. To his credit, one has to say this was before new elections had been called when he started to get them. Now he's trying to present as if he had invented also the vaccines, which is definitely part of the election campaign. But one has to say, and I think this is important, if we link Israel or the prime minister to European leaders or to other friends in the world, and I'll mention Donald Trump or even Bolsonaro or Orban, Netanyahu took the pandemic seriously. From the beginning on, that might be a very big difference, I think, here. So to other populist leaders who his friends didn't react, I mean, were denying or even being very late in recognizing it. And this comes in a framework that Netanyahu had built ties to Eastern European countries in the last years. We know the Visegrad countries, the most Eurosceptic countries. That was an alignment which was built on practical thinking from Israel, saying, well, there are voting patterns in the EU when it comes to Israel. The East is rather pro-Israeli, can counter the western part of Europe. And the eastern part of Europe sees Israel pretty similar to them as kind of an ethnic democracy, or supposedly even fighting a common Muslim enemy in the reading of East European countries. Now there was an interesting twist that also Netanyahu had promised vaccines to countries for diplomatic benefits. So he tied the delivery of vaccines to the move maybe of certain countries to move the embassies to Jerusalem. But this was cancelled. This was seen as not legitimate, so it won't happen. But it had been tried to tie national politics to somehow, the need for vaccines, the pandemia. At the same time, I would say we also had some kind of new geographies appearing during the pandemic, having small countries such as Austria. Kurz is a friend of Netanyahu, but also Denmark. The prime minister was visiting Israel also last week, and you could say Switzerland, which was extremely interested in how Israel handles the crisis. which has to do with the number of people in the country also, saying a similar size of population, where the Swiss wanted very much to know how is it done here, what can we learn from it. And I think this was the same thing like Denmark, the Danish prime minister, and for Kurz as well, you had really similar people. So you could maybe talk of an alignment of small, the same size countries, trying to learn from one example from this bigger laboratory in Israel. So geography also plays there a role. For Israel, it was kind of an easier thing to close borders. I mean, Israel, if you perceive it as a kind of an island in the Middle East. I remember well when the look from Israel to Europe, when the border between France and Germany was closed for a while, and there was an outcry somehow, what would this mean for the European integration process if suddenly now there's a rollback? Seen from Israel, this was seen as something more or less natural. Why not fighting a pandemic in a national way? But it seemed to be a natural thing to have these approaches, but it was definitely seen as something temporary, not something that would really be make a difference in the future. I mean, for Israel, open skies are a crucial thing as much as global connections to the world. This is really built in its functionment and its economy and its ties. So where you had a twist while the airport was closed, there were flights to Dubai for a while, which created a rise in infections, which were diplomatic reasons why these lines had been kept open, which brings us to the new friends in the Gulf countries, and which is going to be my last point. Well, there had been also during the pandemic, in fact, a paradigm shift in the region, where in fact it is not anymore dependent on a solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that Arab countries far beyond Jordan and Egypt, which has been since a while, will make contacts or will normalize their relations with Israel. So this sheds a light on the seemingly changing state of mind in the region, where you have a more pragmatic thinking, less overriding ideological. You could also say more national interests, less universal value oriented. So that meaning the conflict is not off the table, but these Gulf countries are no longer willing to hold back from normalization for this idea. You could also say that talking about universal values, human rights records of these countries are rather poor, very business oriented. Here we have another link to Europe, when recently it was the daughter of the former king of Spain came to Dubai for a vaccine because the father lives there. There was an outcry in Spain that they have no vaccines, and how can they get their vaccines there? So you have a kind of a tourism organized. I mean, one has to mention here that the Emirates are really, I think, second after Israel in terms of vaccinations. And then maybe last, there is another interesting parallel here when it comes to direct interests that people seem to emphasize during this election. Here is when it comes to voters from the Arab minority in Israel, who also right now look how to advance their own interests of their community, putting this first. That doesn't mean that other bigger issues are completely put aside, but by saying, so let's deal with our problems here right now in a very pragmatical approach. There's even one party going so far to think to cooperate with Netanyahu by saying, well, national civil and religious rights are for us more important. We could even do that. This might lead to a split of this. This already led to a split of the votes. The question is whether this will backfire by having just wasted votes, or this might affect things. The result of it is that suddenly the Arab votes in Israel of the minority have become much more relevant than they have ever been, and suddenly having also Israeli big parties, including Netanyahu's Likud party, kind of doing a courtship, getting Arab votes in there as either as candidates in their parties or thinking that they might vote for them, with the idea from within one has a bigger impact, a stronger impact to influence things than being in opposition from the outside. Maybe something that brings us back to our subject as a last remark, there was one of the strategic advisors of Benjamin Netanyahu, Shrolik Einhorn, wrote in Haaretz a piece a few weeks ago where he pointed out for his strategy by saying, well, also minorities, one has to remember minorities also want to get rid of globalized leftist elites. So this is why the national strong narrative of Likud might also be appealing to them. This is again the advisor from the Likud. We will see the results or the non-results, not clear results in a little bit more than or less than 2 weeks. And as Paul just said, it's too early to tell. It's complicated. Thank you.
Thank you, Gisela, so much. Indeed, it is a bit fascinating also. Thank you for that. So we have 15 to 20 minutes for questions. Please do jot your name down into the chat if you'd like to ask one. And I'm going to turn straight over to our audience. And if speakers would like to respond to what they've heard from one another, perhaps they can also do so after we've had some questions from our audience. And I'm going to turn, first of all, to our colleague from Tel Aviv University, Professor Tal Sadeh. Tal, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you, Toby. So I was curious by the different distinctions of Euroscepticism suggested here. Obviously, there are many ways to cut this, hard or soft, whether those are actually interested in dismantling the organization that we call the European Union or just leaving on their own or not. You can distinguish right-wing Eurosceptics from left-wing Eurosceptics, but I think what's in common, there's still something that is common to all these parties, and that is that they are interested in raising national borders. They have a struggle with those who want to lower national borders, broadly speaking. Now, that would make them just European anti-globalists. And I think when you want to consider what defines Euroscepticism, it has to have a theoretical context. And if I use integration theory, then what is really interesting is where these parties stand on the struggle to supranationalize European democracy. That's where the distinction becomes especially interesting. So my point is that any concept, any definition has to service a theory in order to be useful. So in that sense, I think this would be the distinction I would find most interesting. And you can be a Viktor Orban. You may want to turn the European Union into a UN. You may want to renationalize all these policies, but still use those institutions in order to do just that. So that's the important distinction, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tal. Perhaps we might take a second question just for time-saving purposes, and then we can go back to our speakers. Our co-president, Professor Tobias Alfred, would you like to ask your question in person?
Well, as I wrote in the chat window, I would really want to know early evaluation by our French, Dutch and German speakers about if they start to perceive Israel as a kind of Trojan horse in the EU fortress regarding the pandemic. I will give a couple of examples that strike me as, if not problematic, at least questionable. And that is that, as you know, Greece and Cyprus for a while have been in contact, in conversations with Israel to establish green passports at a time that we know that large European countries such as France and even Germany have doubts about the wisdom of green passports for discriminatory reasons, but also probably because it is a matter that they want to discuss among EU members first, and Greece should shut up for the moment and not speak to Israel The other issue is the one you mentioned about Austria and Denmark. Having had bilateral conversations with Israel, as you know, for somehow or co-produce vaccines with Israel or get help from Israel, which is a non-member of the EU. And I read in the press about some question marks made by France about that démarche because it was not an EU kind of démarche. So if you can freely express yourself, I am curious to know if this is my imagination of problems in the future, or if there is something to it.
Thanks, Alfred. Okay, let's go back to our speakers and try to be as brief as you can with such substantive questions, and we'll have a chance to get some more in. Thank you so much. Paul, do you have responses?
Yes. What is very striking is that every day in the French papers and on the French TV, you have doctors and politicians from both the conservative parties and the left-wing parties saying that Israel is the only country to have a solution to the pandemic. This is very important in a country where I would say the image of Israel has been quite bad over the last few years, especially on the left-wing end of the political spectrum. But this is really changing now. The French people say that, well, if it needs some restrictions like those which were enacted in Israel to be true with this pandemic, obviously we should follow the example of Israel.
Thank you, Jean-Yves. Paul, did you have something to respond to what you've heard?
I'll just quickly respond to to Tal's thoughtful comments. I'm a little bit, the assertion was made that all Euroscepticism is about the assertion of borders. I think Euroscepticism and the European Union is a bit like that kind of Indian metaphor of the elephant, the blind, all different people blindfolded holding the elephant and feeling different things. And I think so Euroscepticism is a bit like that. You know, remember for some Eurosceptics, not about borders, it's about democracy. It's about a different sort of, it's not about the national democracy. The EU is insufficiently democratic. It doesn't necessarily mean you want to have a stronger national democracy. I mean, you're right, Tal, and most of it is border centred, but not all of it. And I think you've got to be sensitive to that. The arguments about the EU being insufficiently democratic can lead you to very different solutions. They can lead you to a much more open, more democratic international organisation, or to a more democratic national organisation. And I think you just got to be careful to not overgeneralise. But and the point is taken that it is right wing and left wing. I think we need to, and that's why I think that diversity that comes together in Euroscepticism doesn't necessarily mean it's always quite saying the same thing. It's saying it for different sorts of reasons. And Europe is an interesting kind of, it's almost like a Rorschach test. You know, people see different things in it sometimes.
Thank you, Paul. Stijn, or indeed Constanze or Gisela?
Yeah, I had a very similar point as Paul made, more eloquently than I could have done, really. So I think Euroscepticism is often kind of a proxy for closing borders, but that's mainly among the radical right. So that's how Europe is framed. So one of the reasons that we have a lot of migrants is because the European borders are open. But they, at least in the current Dutch election campaign, they're very reluctant to actually go into specific European policies or the future of European integration more precisely. So it's mainly a proxy for their anti-immigration politics. However, if you look at certain left-wing Eurosceptic parties, they're not necessarily against further integration, but they're in favor of a different type of Europe, namely one that is not about the market, but more about protection of workers. So it's not necessarily only about the closing of borders, I think, Euroscepticism. The second question, I'm afraid I don't have anything intelligent to say about that. I'm afraid, sorry.
No, thank you. That's great. Constanze? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. These are all very interesting questions. And again, I wish we were sitting there in person and hashing this out. That would be a lot more fun. On green passports, look, I have vaccination passports from my infancy. And I have absolutely no problem with carrying a vaccination passport. The larger question, and I say this as a trained constitutional lawyer, is what citizenship rights and abdication of rights we attach to possessing a vaccination. That's an incredibly complex question that I think, again, there is no general answer for. Look, on the borders point, I agree entirely with Paul and Stein, but I want to sort of add something on top of that, which is this. It seems to me that the question that the pandemic has brought to the forefront and that the populists are unable to answer is how do we, in an era of deepening interdependence, despite borders, and increasing competition, including great power competition and competition between democracies and authoritarians, how do we make sure that a society can arrange for the appropriate and decent provision of public goods in a way that is based on common solidarity? And I think what we're rediscovering, oddly, and what America even more oddly is rediscovering, is that there is an important role for the state in this. And I think in general, we've seen in the pandemic that where nation states or supranational institutions for that matter have failed to do that, have failed to provide for public goods in a fair and decent way and an inclusive way, that fuels the populace. Where they manage to do that, it takes air from the populace. And perhaps on another point of where Israel is a Trojan horse, I think where I sort of, because I keep a sharp eye out for the German hard right, one thing that I found truly distressing, and I've mentioned the book by Yoram Hazony before, but as we know, Netanyahu himself and his son even more have played with these motifs, is Israeli flirting, or Israeli intellectuals or politicians flirting with the hard right in America and in Europe in a sort of ethno-nationalist culture warrior framework. I don't have to explain to you why that is particularly distressing for me as a German. But that is where I think that is where my alarm bells go on, and that's the kind of Trojan horse I would prefer not to have. That said, we're perfectly capable of doing this on our own. We don't need Israeli help for that.
Thank you. I'm keen to get another quick round of questions. And Gisela, do you want to comment on the questions so far, or perhaps after the next questions?
I'd like maybe just to suggest one territory for a study. What I found, I was looking very much after different patterns of politics and the pandemic from here and looking at maps. And I was always trying to find whether there are links between higher numbers and the parties from the right and from the left. And when it came to Germany, I think what was particularly striking that you had areas, so you might say they had been at the borders, which have always been more affected, but at a certain moment it became very striking that definitely the areas where the AfD, the far right, is very strong, that you had the highest rates of infected people and also of dead people. So, and this, I think one needs to get some studies done, whether there are some correlations with that, where people were among the AfD and also places where you had deniers, more demonstrations, just denying the whole thing, going against the government, just using this whole thing for national empowerment and getting things down, whether there is some link between the behavior and in a way then also really consequences. But this is, just a feeling when I had this look at the maps all the time, where this also then later on with Eastern Europe, where you would Czechia in Czechoslovakia, Czechia was very strong suddenly. It got very, very much up as well. Just a suggestion.
Thank you, Gisela. So we have time for 3 quick questions and then 3 quick responses from our, or quick responses from our final responses from our panelists. So first of all, our other co-president, Dr. Maya Sion. So Maya's question is, the EU always served as a very convenient scapegoat for leaders of member states. We see it again now during the pandemic, and mostly with regards to the sluggish vaccination operation. For the small amount of vaccines brought to the EU member states, this seems to be a big issue, especially in Germany. To what extent does this topic play a role in favor of Eurosceptic political parties and in election campaigns going on now in the EU? And there was a sort of supplementary to that from Patricia Dorosh. Patricia, would you like to ask a supplementary in person?
If you'd like to. I just wanted to extend that to how this full rollout might be affecting trust or general attitudes towards the European Union among French, German, and Dutch citizens. I think that, yeah, that's participants we have. So, like, for example, in Poland, this is currently quite a big issue that, let's say that the government is kind of using or presenting that the poor vaccine rollout in Poland is because of how we had to, let's say, give into the EU, and that without that we would be better off, even though that there are voices who would be countering that. And another thing is that I think today I read some news about how many vaccines the EU has been actually exporting to other countries outside of the EU, which is again bound or like can be affecting the trust of EU citizens towards the institution.
Thank you, Patricia. And Jewel Whittorf, you also had a question. Would you like to ask it briefly?
Well, my question is also somehow linked. I was more emphasizing on the aspect of how much the right-wing populistic parties in Europe are, under these circumstances, still interconnected and cooperating when we're thinking back about the European elections and the upcoming one, even though that it's not happening in the next 2 years. But if you see there's some mingling and some more cooperation between them because of these circumstances that Patricia explained.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to ask very, very brief final comments. I regret that it's not a lot of time to respond to those questions from our speakers, but we in our association have an annual meeting scheduled next. So a chance for last comments from our speakers. Paul?
I mean, I'd just like to say, generally to respond to the point that I think the vaccine rollout will start to play a big issue. I mean, I think you're seeing two different rationales there. The EU has, and the Commission has worked on the basis of trying to reduce cost and trying to focus on process at the expense of speed. And you see other countries, Israel and then the UK, being faster. There's a different policy focus there. I think the effects of those and any vaccination rollout is also contingent upon national capacity to vaccinate as well. It's not only about having the vaccines. That has a real potential to play out as a Eurosceptic issue. But I also suspect it will be very bound up with frustration with national governments. It'll be hard to disentangle it, but it remains to be seen.
Thank you so much. And Stijn.
Yeah, thanks. I'll give a Dutch perspective. I just had to think about one post I saw of a British journalist, I'm not quite sure who basically made the argument that it really struck a chord with me. And it's about the impact of Corona on Dutch politics and how people see politicians. This journalist, I don't know if there's any real evidence for it, but I do believe there's a truth to it. He said the Netherlands is a high trust country. It's also a very arrogant country. So when the pandemic like this strikes, people have the feeling, well, we are so well organized. The fact that it's so out of control, it's also out of the control of our politicians. And I believe there is something to it. So the people that do not vote for populist parties, they kind of stick with the mainstream parties and they kind of believe they're doing their best. This, again, it's not a very scientific argument, but I think there is some truth to this. Whereas the people that vote for populist, right-wing populist parties, they didn't trust the government and they still don't. And they still vote for these radical right parties, probably for exactly the same reasons that they did before the pandemic. So, of course, even though the world looks very different than it looks a few years from now, at the same time, there seems to be a lot of stability also, if you look at the Dutch case.
Thank you, Stijn. I encourage our participants to take note of some interesting comments also coming in the chat. Jean-Yves.
With regard to cooperation between populist far-right parties, what I can tell you is that Marine Le Pen was very careful from the start of the pandemic not to have party members involved in any kind of street demonstrations that would be akin to those set up by AfD in Germany. She is very fearful that those demos will only boost conspiracy theories, and she doesn't want to be associated with conspiracy theorists. So she really stayed away from all kinds of demos, and will continue to do so.
Thank you so much. Constanze?
Yes, I just saw Gerald Steinberg's comment. That would be worthy of an entire conference, but let me just say, I don't agree. I'm sorry. I think that European and the European and the American hard right has roots that go quite far back. After 45, there was a Nouvelle Droite in France that the Germans very quickly latched onto. And there is a lot of academic work studying these ramifications. And again, I want to put it to you that the key, I think there is an overemphasis on national autonomy as somehow the salvation for countries struggling with globalization and growing interdependence. I think that is a chimera. The question before us is whether we can manage to make our governments and our democratic processes and institutions resilient against a world in which we're going to have more disruptions, more pandemics, more crises, because that is the only way that we can protect them against the nihilist populists whose main enemy isn't the left or the Chinese, but liberal modernity. Thank you.
Thank you, Constanze, so much. And Gisela, do you have a final comment? I regret we don't have more time. We've opened up so many issues, and this has been very, very stimulating for me. We've also, I think, got what we wanted, which was a snapshot of where we are right now. It appears COVID has not overturned European politics yet, but as we take note of Paul's warning from the outset, it may be too soon to tell, and certainly interesting to see in particular what happens in France with Marine Le Pen flying high, but apparently not as a result of Euroscepticism. So many things to think about. I'm going to watch this back on the recording later to make sure I've absorbed it all. I'm extremely grateful to our panelists who've been absolutely, truly outstanding, fulfilled all of our hopes for the insights that they've brought to us. I'm sure we've all found, everybody, I certainly have, found it extremely, extremely enlightening. And thank you everybody also, all our guests who joined us from across Europe and beyond. We hope to see you again at future events. I'm going to leave you now for our annual meeting, but thank you all very, very much, and see you again.